We reject the ideology of globalism, and we embrace the doctrine of patriotism.
Not only will this tax plan pay for itself, but it will pay down debt.
There are moral and legal obligation questions that I think we'll have to wrestle with as a society.
When we as people go wobbly on the truth, we go wobbly on America.
All you have to do is look at the numbers, look at what we've done.
And this is all in the beginning.
From 100.9 FM WXIR, this is Evidence of Design, and I'm your host, Jason Taylor. Evidence of Design is a live talk show about the political economy. We critique income and wealth inequality and support democratic values. Thank you for listening, and welcome. Good morning, everyone. You're tuned in to 100.9 FM WXIR in Rochester. This is Evidence of Design, and I'm your host, Jason Taylor, and we're joined in studio by my good friend and co-host, Mary Lawrence.
Good morning.
Matt Treadwell, our other usual co-host, is still out dealing with a very close family loss, and our thoughts and hearts are with Matt, who will be joining us soon. Today's show is first airing on Saturday, July 11th, 2020. Mary, it's 7-Eleven today.
It's 7-Eleven.
7-Eleven.
Oh.
I don't even know if there's 7-Elevens around here.
Yeah, there's one on Park Ave. I go to all the time.
Oh.
I mean, not now, but used to.
All right. This is quality radio content in Rochester. So first airing Saturday, July 11, 2020. That means we are live for you in the studio, which means we are available to take your calls at 100.9 FM WXIR by giving us a ring at 585-219-8889. But I'm jumping the gun. Let me remind you what our show is all about. Perhaps you're a returning listener or you're tuning in for the first time. Evidence of Design. We are all about critiquing income and wealth inequality. We think there's too much economic inequality in our society right now. We are living through times of historically high economic inequality since modern records were kept. We are living through times of economic inequality so high that it mirrors that which preceded the Great Depression in the Roaring '20s. That means that right now in our society, the top 1% of those who make the most income and wealth control far too large amounts of income and wealth in our society. And that's what we hear about, critiquing the fact that our politics is too much skewed towards the interests of a small, wealthy minority, and too much of our economics is too much skewed towards the interests of a small, wealthy minority to the detriment of all of us. And so we try to analyze this economic inequality, we try to examine where it comes from, and we try to come up with solutions to what we can do about it. Because we believe on Evidence of Design that economic inequality affects almost all aspects of our life, and that our society would be better for everyone, including those who are the wealthy that I'm talking about. It would be better for everyone were we to have a more egalitarian society along economic grounds and, of course, other grounds such as race and gender as well. So on today's show, we'll be continuing forward with our mission and vision by talking with Joe Gentile of the Rochester chapter of the Poor People's Campaign. Many of you may have heard of the Poor People's Campaign before. It has kind of roots in the 1960s, but also they came to the Rochester area this past February before COVID-19 hit. So the Poor People's Campaign is a national movement, and they strive to challenge systemic racism, poverty, the war economy, and ecological devastation. As mentioned, it draws its roots from the Civil Rights Movement and Martin Luther King Jr.'s 1968 Poor People's Campaign. We'll be talking with Joe about the PPC's mission, its history, and its call for a moral revolution and local opportunities to get involved in the movement. We recorded that interview with Joe earlier this week, and it will run for around 40 minutes. However, for now, we always like to start out our show, recently at least, talking about COVID-19 cases. Just to remind folks that COVID-19 is still out there. Forgive me if this sounds kind of trite and obvious, and forgive me if you are bored to death of hearing about COVID-19, but I think it's worth just taking 2 minutes to mention it because we're still all in this together, and unfortunately, we still have to mention it because COVID-19 is the worst it's ever been in the United States. I'm losing my breath because I'm wearing this mask. It's hard to talk for so much wearing the mask. But I guess this is evident as well of we still care about COVID-19. We're wearing our masks in the studio, but this is just a funny phenomenon. I'm going to have to practice now talking with my mask on because I'm just having a harder time. I didn't realize this was a thing, but I'm like gasping for air.
You are wearing a different mask than usual too. I think
it's a little thicker.
You get used to certain ones, and Jason got a nice new fancy mask.
A fancy mask.
It is.
Yeah.
But maybe you just have to get used to it. I still have my, Rochester issued surgical mask.
Right.
So.
I was wearing that kind of standard blue surgical issued mask thing, like the same one for like 3 months. And I don't know if that's if it loses its potency, so to speak. But, it got pretty grimy. So I kind of upgraded to a little thicker material, but now I'm realizing I can't breathe while talking so much. But thankfully we're going to air a recorded interview real soon. But anyways, so we're still wearing our masks in studio. And why is that? Is because COVID-19 is mentioned is the worst it's ever been in the United States. In New York State, we're actually doing comparably fine since we hit our peak before the rest of the country. However, the United States still leads the world by far in the number of COVID-19 cases. We have almost more than twice the amount of cases the next highest country of Brazil. So we have more than 3,300,000 active COVID-19 cases. That's essentially 1 in every 100 people. That's a really, really damning statistic, and our deaths are more than 136,000. It's incredibly sad. Cases are rising right now in around 44 states. So really,
that's most of the states.
That's most of the states, yeah. History class was a long time ago, but that's most of the 50 states, and the Northeast of the United States is really the only part of the U.S. where cases are in the decrease for right now.
Are they still in decline in New York State, or are they rising again at all?
I believe most of the
recently.
northeastern states have cases that are declining, hence the fact that 44 states right now have cases that are rising. So these numbers are always kind of fluctuating and whatnot, but the overall trend is very bad. If you folks have seen the graph out there, like it's on any major news networks, New York Times, etc., of kind of the graph of the COVID-19 cases in the U.S. over time, it kind of starts pretty slow in early March, and then it dramatically spikes and rises. It looks kind of like an exponential curve. And that's kind of when we were in our worst point in New York. And then it's kind of for a while, for kind of over a month, declines a little bit, like a steady but slow decline. And then in the past 2 or 3 weeks, it's just been zoop right back up again, way past the aforementioned peak that we were experiencing earlier on in New York. And so it's quite scary. And the point of mentioning all this is just a reminder, just a general PSA. Hey, we're still on this together with COVID-19. I'm optimistic that this too shall pass, but I believe also what Dr. Fauci said, that the virus makes the timeline. We don't. We can influence the virus's timeline by still continuing to practice physical distancing and mask wearing and all that. But let's continue to be all in this together. And I know it's hard to have to continue to have this kind of virus fatigue, but we will get through it faster if we kind of take the steps we need now. I think a lot of it about working out. I know everyone knows that you should work out, and you've kind of fed the message that, well, if you work out now and take care of your body now and eat healthy, later on in your life you'll be kind of, that much better and you won't have many health problems. And I kind of think of it that way, that we're investing in our future now. So we're all in this together, and I'm optimistic this too shall pass. Mary, why don't we turn our attention now to the interview I recorded earlier this week with Joe Gentile of the Rochester chapter of the Poor People's Campaign. Again, this interview runs for around 40 minutes, but you're welcome to give us a call throughout the interview at 585-219-8889. Again, that's 585-219-8889. You're listening to Evidence of Design on 100.9 FM WXIR in Rochester. Let's learn more together now about the Poor People's Campaign here on 100.9. Joe Gentile is a recently retired licensed clinical social worker who formerly worked in private practice as well as retired from the University of Rochester Medical Center. Joe has been active with the Poor People's Campaign since 2018. He's now serving as the Rochester Regional Committee co-chair, as well as serving on the New York State Coordinating Committee for the Poor People's Campaign. Joe, welcome to Evidence of Design.
Thank you, Jason. It's a pleasure to have this opportunity to speak with you about the Poor People's Campaign and the work we're about here in Rochester.
Well, let's start from the top. What is the Poor People's Campaign? What is your mission?
Some people don't recall the origins of the original Poor People's Campaign, but back in 1967, Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King talked about, and I can quote him here, he said, "The dispossessed of this nation, they must organize a revolution against the injustice, not against the lives of the persons who are their fellow citizens, but against the structures through which the society is refusing to take means which have been called for and which are at hand to lift the load of poverty. There are millions of poor people in this country who have very little or even nothing to lose. If they can be helped to take action together, they will do so with a freedom and a power that will be a new and unsettling force in our complacent national life." So I think back in 1967, Dr. King was addressing and identifying several evils that were prevalent in our society. And at that time, in May of '68, there was the Resurrection City March and Encampment, which unfortunately occurred a month or two after he was killed. And it was the goal was to mobilize people to come together across their differences and to look at the interlocking evils that were identified at the time. And at the time when they were addressing those evils, they included structural racism, poverty, and war and the war economy. And with the re-emergence of our campaign back in 2016 and 17, the issue of ecological devastation was incorporated. The founders of the modern Poor People's Campaign, Dr. William Barber and Reverend Dr. Liz Theo Harris, were in 2016 and 2017, were engaging in Moral Mondays, were establishing some protests and some presence in the state capitol in North Carolina. And they initiated this to readdress and to look at an analysis of what has happened in our country since the day of Martin Luther King. And I like to think of it as a movement that started with analysis. And one of the original documents of that analysis was the audit which occurred, the souls of the poor folk. And basically what that was an organizational look, a deep look, both at documents and history, but also at current lived experiences of people. And what the key points of that, I think, that are important for our listeners to understand was the facts and the figures and the faces of that study came up with two real myths that we were dealing with in our society. The first myth was that poverty was the fault of the poor. And that was an enduring narrative that I think really undermined the movement back in the 60s and 70s. We got into the criminalization of the poor, we got into mass incarceration. In any movement, when there's a success, it's quickly co-opted. I think a lot of money was poured into helping the poor, but clearly the agenda was that people had to pull themselves up by their bootstraps. It was a personal responsibility. So that the report demonstrates that these issues have deepened since 1968, and we continue to blame people for their own, for the systematic situation that we've placed them in purposely throughout the years. The other second important myth, I think, that comes out of that initial audit was, despite our abundance, there is a myth that there's not enough for all of us to survive and thrive. And, I think one of the challenges is that this audit called us to do was to look at the structures of our nation and how our budgets and spending is utilized, and it is to make some demands and some changes around systematic racism, poverty, the war economy, and ecological devastation.
In explaining the modern Poor People's Campaign, it's really a through line through history. You're connecting it back to the work of Martin Luther King Jr., among others. And a lot of folks might not know or may have forgotten that MLK also, in addition to working for racial equality, worked on other forms of social justice. You mentioned kind of a trifecta of racial equality, focusing on abolishing poverty, and then focusing on reducing the war economy. And now you mentioned that the Poor People's Campaign has also included ecological devastation. Do you have any thoughts on why we now remember MLK's legacy so much on racial equality and not so much on the economic arguments MLK was making as well?
Well, let me give you an example. I learned in watching some documentaries that, the women's suffragette movement took 70 years. And in the end, the myth was that these women were given the right to vote. I think it's more popular to think of Reverend Martin Luther King as a hero of racial justice and not one who really challenged the core capitalistic structures of our society, which benefits from the exploitation of the poor people, and also benefits from keeping us divided. I think the Reverend King's legacy is that he saw this as a fusion movement, and I think that was a threat to the establishment. And by fusion movement, I mean that, for example, there are more commonalities among us than there are differences when it comes to poverty. I think the majority of people in this country who are poor are white people, but proportionally people of color are more poor. And so I think what happened was they set us up in opposition to one another. I think the threat of Reverend Martin Luther King was that he was drawing cohorts together to fight the establishment and was making the connections and drawing the dots. And I think that was threatening to the establishment and to the corporate structure of our world, and it was politically not popular.
I think every school child in this country probably knows about Martin Luther King Jr.'s I Have a Dream speech. That was in his 1963 March on Washington. A lot of folks might not know that that march was, the full name of it was the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom.
Correct.
The Poor People's Campaign just had their own March on Washington this past June 20th. Of course, COVID-19 is going on, so the march was held virtually, I believe. Do you want to tell us a little bit about how that recent march went and what your organization did?
I think the June 2020 was really a culmination of efforts that have been building for years. Back in 2017, 2018, really 2018, there were truth commissions which were held around the country. And at these commissions, people were given the opportunity to testify to the impact of these four evils on their lives. The thing I want to emphasize about the movement is it's about changing the narrative by changing the narrative. And the goal of the movement is to center and amplify the voices of the poor people and people of color and people who are marginalized. And that was a political threat to this country. So June 20th was the culmination of years of work. And like I said, there was in June, in 2018, there were 40 days of actions, which at that point was the largest coordinated effort of civil disobedience in our history. And throughout the country, over those 40 days, every Monday in each state capital, there were protests, and each week there was a different theme focused on the evils and some of the other demands of the campaign. And in June 2018, there was a moral action conference in D.C., and the committees addressed the budget, the Congressional Budget Committee. And the message that was brought, which was really carried forward to the June 2020, is that the people you need to hear from are the people that are impacted by poverty, by homelessness, by prejudice, by marginalization, by outright violence. And not responding to the needs of the people is in itself a violent act. And I think what June 2020 showed us was it gave us a chance to really, we couldn't have done this if we did it in Washington, because there would have been, one giant stage and thousands and thousands of people. But it really gave us a chance to go across the country and highlight whether it's Michigan, whether it's California, whether it's Texas, the same issues we're addressing people who are living below the poverty line or very close to the poverty line. And I believe right now there's 140 million people in this country who are in poverty or one emergency away from being in poverty. And there's 8 to 11 million people who are homeless or on the verge of homelessness. And one of the things we're demanding is immediately a $15 minimum wage increase, and that be increased in the next 2 years to a $22 an hour wage, which is known as the housing wage. I remember reading somewhere that if the minimum wage kept pace with the cost of living, the minimum wage right now would be about $33 an hour. Mm-hmm. So there's another myth there is that, you know, there are self-made millionaires. And if you look at the analysis, there's no self-made millionaires. Millionaires either get their income or their wealth from legacy, from inheritance, or from exploiting workers. And, you know, that's very evident in our modern world. And I can talk more about that when I talk a little bit about some of the demands of the current demands that have been put forth as the Jubilee Justice Platform. Some of the other stuff that was happening while this movement was engaging in actions was it was base building. And there were van tours around the state as well. In New York, there was one in Western New York, and there was one on Long Island and downstate. And these tours, again, got into the neighborhoods, got into the communities, and talked to people about what their lived experience was. And part of our leadership development is helping people get their voice heard and bring it around their leadership and their actions.
You're listening to Evidence of Design on 100.9 FM WXIR in Rochester. We're talking with Joe Gentile, a representative from the Rochester Poor People's Campaign. Joe, I want to get back to that poverty statistic you cited and how the Poor People's Campaign measures poverty. But before we get there, why don't we talk about some of the more specific demands from the Poor People's Campaign? You've already mentioned this historical through line between now and the 1960s, where we are still, more than 50 years later, combating systemic racism, poverty, our war economy, also combating new issues, more modern issues like ecological devastation and modern criminalization. Can you be more specific about what the specific demands are of the Poor People's Campaign?
Sure, and I can also say, you know, in light of COVID-19, I think that epidemic has put a dramatic spotlight on the fissures that have existed in our systems and in our society. Even before, you know, during and before COVID, 700 people a day die from poverty. And actually in Rochester, there was a study that came out in the fall. People living in poverty had the worst outcome in every health measurement. So basically what I want to say is that there is a platform, and the 4 or 5 key points of that platform are, and it's grounded in principles that everybody is in and nobody's out, that everybody in this nation deserves our nation's abundance. And it also states that instead of starting with trickle down, we start with bottom up, that we have to lift people from the bottom up and then everybody rises. I like to say if there's a hole in your end of the boat, we're all going down. Also, we have to prioritize the leadership of the poor and low income, and they are on the front lines of the crisis, and they must lead us into identifying solutions. So any solutions that are addressed without those impacted folks at the table is not appropriate. And also, we need to look at our values in this country. I like to think, you know, we talk about life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. I really think we forgot about the first statement there, that life is the key. And we deprive so many people in this country of the wherewithal to live their lives in any way. So anyway, the platform goes into great detail. The first part is about ending racism and the right to democracy and equal protection under the law. So one of the demands is that we protect and expand the right to vote, that we end voter suppression, that we protect and honor the rights of our First Nation, Indigenous, and Native people, that we end police violence and mass incarceration, and that we establish a national truth commission based on these injustices. We also want to protect the immigrant communities and recognize their role in our society. We want to secure quality, equitable, and diverse public education for all, and to protect public education. And we also demand that we relieve student debt and provide free college for all. We want to also promote the general welfare and make sure that people have the right to welfare and an adequate standard of living. So there's talk about changing the poverty measure to really reflect what current situations are. It must be pegged at the median of living and include other expenses like housing, utilities, childcare, etc. And we have to ensure an adequate standard of living that is measured by this threshold. We have to redefine welfare as a right, not a burden. We have to protect and expand Social Security, SSI, and SSD insurance. We want to make sure that we have secure housing for all. We have to acknowledge to the full extent that there is housing insecurity in this country, and we have to establish housing as a legal right. And that includes stopping evictions, including federal rental assistance, identifying vacant properties, and preparing them to house people who are housing insecure, minimize the use of shelters. We're calling for a cancellation of rent and mortgages that have not been paid during the pandemic, and ensuring the right to work with dignity. We feel the need that we need to update the unemployment measure and expand unemployment coverage, establish a universal and guaranteed adequate income, like I said before, raise the minimum wage to $15 an hour and enact a housing wage within 2 years. And also they call for a jobs program, a federal jobs program to secure full employment as a right. Also the freedom to associate and to form and join unions. And included in these demands is the need for secure to secure the right to health and a healthy environment. We are looking for an expansion of Medicaid and protective Medicare, and we're looking to establish a single-payer universal healthcare system. So we have to protect and secure healthcare for all. Ending medical debt, expanding our healthcare infrastructure. Through the years with the for-profit healthcare systems, hospitals have closed. I mean, if you saw the June 2020 presentation, there are people in our rural communities that live a 45-minute drive from a hospital. So those folks don't have access to adequate health care. There's also people in this country who don't have access to clean water. And so we're looking for a moratorium on all shutoffs, relieving water and utilities debt. Declare climate change a national emergency, rejoin the Paris Climate Agreement, and establish a Green Job Corps within this program. Finally, we got to end the culture of war. And I think I think senators and congressional folks are looking at this right now. We need to cut the military budget by $350 billion. I read somewhere if we cancel one contract for a helicopter for the Pentagon, we could fund Head Start for the entire country. So we're asking that the military budget be cut by $350 billion, that we look at closing foreign bases and cutting unnecessary weapons, and don't reauthorize the Budget Control Act, which expires in 2022, but instead disconnect military spending from social welfare spending and redirect military resources that we cut towards securing basic needs here at home. We want to demilitarize our communities. We want to put an end to police violence, incarceration, and demilitarize the U.S.-Mexican border. And again, implement fair taxes and penalties on the wealthy. Taxation will raise $8.9 trillion over the next 10 years. That can be used to support the programs that we're proposing. And this would include a wealth tax on ultramillionaires and billionaires, raising the top individual tax rate, and restoring corporate tax rates to 35%, and relieving debts of those who cannot pay, individual medical debts, housing debts, water utility debts, etc. So again, it's quite an ambitious program. It's well thought out, well planned. And I want to point out, too, that we're not a partisan organization. We're a political organization. We invite and encourage people to vote. We want to make Election Day a national holiday. We support voter registration by mail, voting by mail, etc. But we do not support candidates, but we invite candidates to look at our platforms and to endorse these platforms and to commit to this. And to this date, there's not been a presidential debate on poverty. And that was one of the things that our leaders were calling for to happen.
Let me reintroduce you here for those who might be tuning in. You're listening to 100.9 FM WXIR in Rochester, and this is Evidence of Design. This hour, we're talking with Joe Gentile. He's a recently retired licensed clinical social worker who has been active with the Poor People's Campaign since 2018. He's now serving as the Rochester Regional Committee co-chair, as well as serving on the New York State Coordinating Committee for the Poor People's Campaign. Joe, you were just reading off a list of the Poor People's Campaign's demands and objectives, and I will say, maybe this is unprofessional for me as interviewer, but when I read the websites of various political candidates, let's say, I like to see very detailed issues pages because I like to know exactly what the candidates stand for and what they kind of propose to fight. The Poor People's Campaign has a very robust, I found it to be a very robust list of issues and demands they want to tackle, and that can be found on the Poor People's Campaign's website in addition to those that you were reading off. So it's a very robust platform. I want to turn our attention now, though, to a slightly different aspect of the campaign, and that's the notion of a moral revival. This perhaps might not be a specific policy objective, but instead is a kind of larger philosophical or theoretical change. So would you mind explaining in your own words what the moral revival is that the Poor People's Campaign would like to achieve, and why that notion of a moral revival is important for America now in the year 2020?
Good question. My personal take on this is that we've lost sight of what our nation was founded on, and that was equity and freedom for all people. And I think the moral agenda has been hijacked in some ways by some organizations to misrepresent what is fundamentally the call of all religious and spiritual belief systems and people of faith. And that is the number one responsibility of a government, of an organization, is to take care of its citizenry. And I think we have put profit before caring for our citizens, all of our citizens. And that's the moral objective that I believe our campaign is calling for, reclaiming the need to care for our fellow citizens and to be compassionate for all, and not to be prejudicial about who they are or what they look like or who they love or what they do or don't do in their lives. And so I think that got politicized through the years. One other thing, we're not a religious movement, we're a moral movement. So that people of faith, atheists, people with different beliefs, it's a very wide umbrella. And what we don't want to do is get caught up in, which path is the best path. We think there are many paths that could lead to equity and social justice, but we have to work together and we have to listen to one another.
This notion of a moral revival, the notion that, for example, the number one responsibility, as you mentioned, of our government is to care for its citizens, not care for profit. We're living through a dynamic time in American history. For example, we've already talked a little bit about COVID-19. We haven't yet talked about the recent Black Lives Matter protests in response to the killings of just George Floyd, for instance. Do you see this moral revival as taking on a greater awareness and greater steam in light of these national tragedies?
Oh, yes, absolutely. I remember the 60s somewhat, and the only information you got in those days was what the three major networks showed you. So it was very easy for them to stop reporting the number of deaths in Vietnam. It was very easy for them to stop televising the coffins that were coming home from Vietnam. But now, with the evidence of violence in our faces every day, it's hard to unsee it. And once you see something like that, and you take that in, you can't unsee it, and you can't stop thinking about it. I read something recently that more people have participated in protests than any other time in the history of our country, and that a lot of these people are first-time protesters, and a lot of folks are coming from many different walks of life. So once, it's like, I can give you a personal experience. What's locked in my brain right now is that I was taught that George Washington had wooden teeth. That's what we were taught. So there's a lot of unpacking that we have to do, that I have to do as a white man who, it's like telling a fish that he's wet. It's hard to explain, but there's a lot of personal work we have to do. There's a saying in our movement that political education isn't on the agenda. Political education is the agenda. And I think what this time calls for is all of us to acknowledge the roots of our nation. And the roots of our nation have been in exploitation and the genocide of the native people that were living here, the enslavement of people that we brought to this country, the withholding of their rights, the penalties and the fines and the fees and the incarceration that they still face. It's just remarkable. So I think there's a lot of soul searching that's going on, and I think there's room for all of it. I think Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King said that violence was the voice of the unheard. He did not encourage violence, but he recognized that it existed. But if you're going to look at that violence, then you got to look at the violence of not giving people health care, of not giving people a living wage, of relying on our essential workers, but treating them as if they were expendable. I mean, that's violence. So I think I'm optimistic. I think that there's a reawakening in this country, and there's a concept too that I'm aware of called the extinction theory. Whenever, I'm a social worker. Whenever behaviors change, well, first of all, you have to identify a behavior. And it's like, if you were a cigarette smoker, how many years would a cigarette smoker look at that warning on the pack of cigarettes that says, warning, cigarette smoking can cause death and cancer. But if you don't recognize that and say that and own that, then you can't take action on it. So I think what's happening in this country is I think people are waking up to the violence and the death that has been disproportionately inflicted on poor and people of color. And now the next step is to, well, what are you going to do about it? How can you become active? And that may be, talking with people, learning more, interrupting people, challenging people in your family or in your life, not listening to certain stories. I was having a conversation with my children about some of the nursery rhymes we used to recite when we were kids, and how we didn't know how racist they were. And so being able to have conversations about that in your daily lives. So there's a lot to be done besides, in addition to being a disruptor.
You reminded me in this talk about political education and the connection to the notion of a moral revival of a post-colonial theorist by the name of Frantz Fanon. He wrote in the 60s in a book called The Wretched of the Earth, and a quote that he wrote roughly goes, "It is commonly thought with criminal flippancy that a political education means from time to time haranguing the masses with a political speech. But political education means opening up the mind, awakening the mind, and introducing it to the world. It is to invent the souls of men." And that quote, of course, men being in the time that he wrote it in the 60s, it'd be to invent the souls of people now. But that quote always stuck with me, with the notion of a political education is really opening up people's awareness to living in a diverse, multicultural society that looks out for the interests of all people. Again, perhaps I'm overstepping my bounds here as the interviewer, but that always stuck with me.
No, I have to say I'm surrounded by books and podcasts and emails that I send to myself of articles that I want to read. But so I think we're all learners. And the other, we learn There's a great quote that we have in our movement. Well, there's a couple of them. One is, you don't get anything, you only get what you organize to take, and that comes from the National Union of the Homeless. But also there's another one that I keep on my desk, and that is, we learn as we lead, we walk as we talk, and we teach as we fight. And that comes from Ashley Huffnagel. And it reminds me too of something else I came across today. This system cannot fail because it was never designed to protect people. That's why the system has to change. It was never designed to take care of the people in this nation. So when we talk about a system failing, it's not failing, it's doing exactly what it was set out to do, to not take care of our poorest and most marginalized people, and to develop a ruling class.
Connected to the idea that our system can't fail because indeed so-called failing its citizens is part of its inherent design, the Poor People's Campaign takes on the idea that poverty is the fault of the poor. At the start of this interview, you mentioned indeed that it's kind of one of our primary myths in this country, that poverty is the fault of the poor. Why do you say that poverty is instead the result of structures and immoral policies and not someone's individual failings?
It would go back to the history in this nation that we have of not allowing access for people to poor people for avenues of advancement. For example, it would be great to say, let's hire an African American teacher, and I think that's marvelous, and I think we ought to do more of that. But if you go upstream, why don't we have more African American teachers? Well, that's because they didn't have access to schools. Why didn't they have access to good schools? Well, because of redlining. They were living in communities where they were prevented from having access because of the tax base. They were prevented from getting mortgages. They were prevented from living in certain communities. So I think we segregated ourselves very early on, and the access that some folks had, a lot of other people didn't have. One of the books I read years ago was a story of Robert Moses, and the thing that struck me was when they were expanding and building out on Long Island some of the roadways, they intentionally made the bridges on the Southern State Parkway too low for buses to go through, because they intentionally wanted to keep people without automobiles, without the means to have their private transportation off of the island. So, I mean, you have to go way back to unpack the roots of this. And the roots of this are in, inadequate access to education, the failure of the Veterans Act to provide for people of color to have access to quality educations, to have access, like I said, to jobs, and access to living situations.
You're listening to Evidence of Design on 100.9 FM WXIR in Rochester. We're talking with Joe Gentile, a representative from the Rochester Poor People's Campaign. Let's zoom in now, Joe. The Poor People's Campaign is a national campaign, and there's also local branches. Rochester has one of which you're a representative. Do you want to tell us a little bit about some of the local events and opportunities that the Poor People's Campaign has going on here in Rochester?
Sure. We have meetings of our core leadership team a couple times a month, and one of the ways you can get involved is if you were to go to nyspppc.org, you could sign up, and your name and contact information would get sent to us here locally. There's also a form online that you could fill out, which describes our organization and it inquires about your interests and your potential, what you could bring to the campaign, what the campaign can bring to you. And you can fill that out by going to bit.ly/join NYS, JOINNYS. And also, we encourage people, as you said, to go to either nyspppc.org and look at our resource page. Educating yourself, reading our documents, Locally, we're about joining with other people and raising up other people's work. For example, in Rochester, we are very much behind the National Homeless for the Union, Citywide Tenants Union, the Police Accountability Board, the efforts in New York State to bring about Medicare for all. And so we support those initiatives. So if you're involved with an organization, a church group, a study group, a recovery group, wherever you're involved, you can be in touch with us and we'll talk about how we can liaison our work and bring our messages to you. The movement is about relationship building. And we have a saying too that it's just as much about bringing the movement within you as it is getting the movement out there. So it's really a transformative experience we're talking about. Another thing you can do is go to our ROC PPC Facebook page and message us there. There's also an upcoming event on July 22nd, and it's a great opportunity. It's more of an expansion of what I've been attempting to do here today. It's a PPC 101 course, and you can sign up for that. It's July 22nd, I believe it's 6 to 8 p.m., and you can sign up for that by going to bit.ly/PPC 101 722, and it's a 2-hour presentation on the history of the Poor People's Campaign and the movement in New York State and opportunities to get involved. You know, people can get involved by becoming a donor, and a donor could donate $1 a month. We are looking for people to do phone banking to help us know about what events are important to you and invite us into your space. You know, it's really been frustrating with COVID having to do everything on Zoom. But the exciting thing about Zoom is, you know, you don't have to get in your car and drive to a meeting. If you're involved with an organization or a church, we'll Zoom in with us, or we'll Zoom in with you. The other thing is we recently, we endorse other people's initiatives. We endorsed the initiative of the Greater Rochester Black Agenda Group that declared that racism is a health crisis. And we support them in their work. You know, we support the Police Accountability Board. There's a lot of things we're involved with that we want to support. So it's about building bridges between movements and bringing people together around movements. And you can do that. Like I said, there's phone banking, there's meetings to plan, there's fundraisers you can host. But basically, it's about keeping yourself informed and getting informed and starting to talk with other people in your world.
The Rochester branch of the Poor People's Campaign has also supported local Black Lives Matter protests, and such as the ones hosted by the Free the People Rock organizers. Is that right?
Yes, we do. We support them, and some of our people have gotten out there for that. The other thing I have to point out is we are a all-volunteer organization. We're housed or anchored by the nonprofit organizations, the Repairers of the Breach, which Dr. Reverend William Barber is involved with, is the chair of, and also the Caro Center at the Union Theological Seminary. Dr. Liz Theo Harris is there. And we're run completely by volunteers from our 9 or 10 regional committees. And we do get some staffing support and sponsorship from the New York State Labor Religion Coalition in Albany. And our executive director there is the Reverend Emily McNeil, and the lead organizer there is the Reverend Joe Paparone. So we do have good support and good networking. The New York State campaign is one of the largest and most active in the nation, and we're proud of that. And we're always looking to expand and to bring more people in, and so we can work together and coalesce our energies.
Well, I think we'll have to end our conversation there. Joe Gentile is a recently retired licensed clinical social worker who formerly worked in private practice, as well as retired from the University of Rochester Medical Center. Joe has been active with the Poor People's Campaign since 2018, and he's now serving as the Rochester Regional Committee co-chair, as well as serving on the New York State Coordinating Committee for the Poor People's Campaign. Joe, thanks for joining us.
Oh, thank you for this opportunity.
And we're back live on 100.9 FM WXIR in Rochester. You're listening to Evidence of Design. Just one more reminder, if you want to check more about the Poor People's Campaign, you can go to poorpeoplescampaign.org, and you can check out the local branch of the PPC by searching for the ROC PPC Facebook group. I hope you enjoyed that interview with Joe Gentile, learning more about their movement. and for joining us on your local grassroots community radio station, 100.9 FM WXIR. We are live on Evidence of Design on Saturdays from 11 a.m. to 12 p.m., and you can always tune in to catch us then. You can also tune in to our other episodes. They are podcasted on YouTube. I know isn't the best place to have podcasted audio content, YouTube. You can blame me for that one. But you can go ahead and search our other episodes on YouTube by searching for the Evidence of Design YouTube channel. Be specific with your search. Search for Evidence of Design, episode 1 through 101, and it will pop up for you. You can also communicate with us throughout the week by connecting with us via our Facebook and Twitter handles. They are Radio EOD. And you can also email us at radioeod@gmail.com. Again, that stands for Evidence of Design. We're going to end our hour here. I was your host, Jason Taylor, on Evidence of Design. And up next is the Esquire Hour. They always put on a great, informative show, so stay tuned for them as well. Thank you all for listening and tuning in. Again, stay safe out there. We mentioned last week that physical distancing is not social distancing, so stay physically distant, but please do not be socially distant, because we all need each other more than ever in these trying times. Intro and outro music, as always, is provided by Modest Mouse with their song Dramamine off of their album A Long Drive with Nothing to Think About. I was your host, Jason Taylor, also joined in studio by a good friend and co-host, Mary Lawrence, and our other co-host, Matt Treadwell, will be back soon dealing with a family loss. He is in our hearts. Be well, be safe, take care, and bye-bye.